Father, we bring our hearts before you, Lord, and thank you for this opportunity that you've given us. We are grateful for the ways that you've been working in and through our lives, Lord Father. Once again, we commit ourselves for these sessions that is we're gonna hear as Jacob gonna take us through various aspects of how we defend the faith in a world where a lot of questions, doubts, skepticism remains to be the real danger. And we pray, Lord Father, you equip us, bless us, help us to be humble, to know the fact that more than all the strategies that we use, until the Spirit of God moves, this soul will go in vain. Holy Spirit of God, as Jacob brings the session before us, Lord Father, we pray that we'll be able to grasp and he'll be able to speak your word, and we will be blessed together, Lord, through the sessions, Master. Committing ourselves once again, thank you for helping us. May your name be glorified. In the name of Jesus, we all pray together.
All right. Now, as with last time's session, what we're going to do is we're going to cover two case makers for the existence of God, and then we will do a bit of hands-on interaction. But this time, since we have a small turnout, we won't be doing breakout rooms. We will do it here in this large gathering as well. So during that time, if you can come on video, that will make the interaction much more lively. And again, you all know each other. We're all part of the same church, so even now I use the present tense. We are part of the same church instead of I were. So if you come on video at that point, that'll be great. All right, let me go ahead and share right now. Okay. Just a second. Yeah, there we go. All right. So as I mentioned in the group, last week we covered two case makers for the existence of God. One had to do with the origin of the universe, and the other had to do with the design of the universe. So here we're going to do two more, and I've taken a case maker that's quite interesting for us to look at, and personally also for us to keep mulling about as we go about. But also on another note, something that can be brought up in a conversation without it being quite jarring as a theological thing to do, or quite jarring as giving the impression that you're talking about God, right? So that's the first one. It has that advantage. You can bring it up as a casual interaction, a food for thought, just a philosophical time pass, but then use that to make the case for God. And then the other one is what I consider to be one of the most persuasive, most convincing case maker for God. And I would say that in terms of its impact on the human conscience of the person who interacts with you as well, I would say to some extent it's more powerful and moving than the resurrection argument that we make. That is not to say that the resurrection is not central to the Christian faith or anything of that, but for the resurrection argument, you go into history, you need to know the historical method, you have to deal with historical facts, and there is a lot of wiggle space for people to say, oh, that's not reasonable, that's not plausible, and all of that. But with the second case making that we can look at, it's very difficult to do that. So, mathematics and morality. The first one we're going to look at is mathematics and God, then we look at evil and God, and then finally we'll do the apologetics lab. Right, mathematics and God. How can mathematics play the part of being a case maker for God's existence? So what you're going to see on screen are different numerals that we see across three different languages, right? So you have Arabic, English, and just Malayalam. Malayalam is almost out of touch within our Kerala community because we just use the English numbers, but this is the Malayalam numerals there. Now, these numerals, this number system is a form of language. Just like we use the word pathar to talk about rock, kallar to refer to rock, we are able to refer and speak about something that is objectively out there, something that is tangibly out there, but then describe it in different languages. It appears that that is also the case with numbers, right? All of these numerals there refer to the same thing. So the 0 in Arabic, the 0 in English, and the 0 in Malayalam even though they're written in different format, all refer to one single entity, if I may use the word. So one thing is clear, numbers, no matter how you write it, refer to an objective underlying truth about reality, something that's objectively out there. We just use different languages to get by. And what we also see is that even though numbers don't exist in a tangible form, you can't go out and touch the number 2 or the number 5 or the number 7. Even though you're not able to touch or interact with it, they correspond to reality in a very clear way. So even though 5, 2, and 7 are not tangible things, unlike apples, the numbers 5 plus 2 equals 7 makes sense in reality. So we start to see two things. One is they exist in a non-physical form. We have never seen the true number 2. We have just seen a linguistic expression of the number 2. That's what we saw before, right? In Arabic, in English, in Malayalam. That's all that we have seen. The Roman numeral or the English Latin numerals, or something of that sort. But we've never seen the true number 2. On the other hand, if you talk about a table, a chair, a rock, an elephant, a balloon, you can describe it in different words, you can draw it up, but you can still see the real tangible thing right before you. You can touch it, interact with it, and then describe it in different ways. But that's not the case with numbers. And when I was preparing for this presentation, I was thinking, imagine you run into a person who has never interacted with or heard of the idea of numerals or numbers. Like zero concept of it, absolutely no idea about it. How will you try and explain numbers to them? How will you try and explain numerals to them? Right? It's extremely difficult for us to go about explain it, to say what a number is, without doing some sort of circular reasoning or going in circles. So not only do numbers exist in this non-physical, non-tangible, immaterial form, they exist in some sense, that's why we are able to deal with it, but we also see it correspond with the reality as well. We also see it play out in reality. We also see it making sense in the tangible world. With apples or tables or cars, when we refer and we apply numbers to this, we see them making sense there. So they exist in what we call as an abstract form. And what do we mean by abstract? When we say something is abstract, it refers to something that is, first of all, immaterial, right? Not in a material form. And they are abstract because they are unable to do anything. The number 7 by itself doesn't do anything. The number 2 by itself doesn't do anything. They are what we call causally impotent. They do not cause anything. They are there. On the other hand, again, just to pique someone's interest, our thoughts are immaterial, but they are concrete. Meaning what philosophers would say that the thoughts can bring about an effect. You can think about something and then that thoughts drive you to do something. Or the human mind, immaterial, but it brings about an effect. But numbers, unlike the thought and the mind, even though it exists immaterially, is unable to do anything. It doesn't bring about any effect in the real world. It doesn't do anything. But yet, it corresponds with the real world. Like I said, these are discussions that you can bring up with your friends and then slowly bring them to ponder about where does this lead us, the miracle nature or the mysterious nature of the existence of numbers. Now, here's the stunning part. I don't know how many of you know this chap on the left. This is Peter Higgs. He's a British, I think his actual title would be a mathematician. So Peter Higgs, 30 years before he became popular, sitting at his desk, using higher order complex mathematics, predicted the existence of an element. And 30 years after his work, after spending millions of dollars and thousands of man hours, the Large Hadron Collider was built in Europe, in Switzerland. So it sits around an entire village, an entire city, and they're going to build an even larger one. I think the Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland, I think it has a radius of 27 kilometers or maybe circumference of 27 kilometers. And there's another one that's going to come up close by to it at a limit of 100 kilometers. So after spending millions of dollars, thousands and thousands of man hours, finally they detected the Higgs boson. Now that was predicted by Peter Higgs using mathematics he scribbled on paper. So how is it that it's not just that numbers can be used to capture the real world, numbers can be used to interact with the real world, numbers can be used to describe the real world, but that numbers can go into such extreme depth that they have this mysterious tangle with the physical world, that you can use numbers to predict the existence of never before discovered entities. This is what Eugene Wigner, Nobel laureate, touched upon in his writing, The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics. And that is a fundamental idea behind the case that we are making. He said that the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in the natural sciences, it is difficult to avoid the impression that a miracle confronts us here. The miracle of the appropriateness of the language of mathematics for the formulation of the laws of physics is a wonderful gift which we neither understand nor deserve. So this is the case. We have this immaterial, abstract, unable to bring about or cause any effect on its own things that exist. In what form do they exist? Philosophers are still happy to debate about it. Is it realism, anti-realism, neutralism? You can get into whole sort of dialogue. So numbers, we know that it exists in some form. We've never seen it, we've never touched it, we've never smelled it, but it exists. And it exists and it interacts with the human mind. And we are able to use these unseen, immaterial entities, again, to use the word very loosely, to then capture the natural world out there. Like when we talk about sending someone to space, in our last session, I showed you the Newtonian equation, right? Force is equal to gravity into m1 into m2 by r. In all of that, we are using these numbers to capture the force of gravity, the gravitational constant. We are using these numbers to capture the relation between strong and weak nuclear force. We are using these numbers to capture, make sense, predict, navigate, and do all sorts of complex things about the universe. To look far beyond the galaxies and to figure out what sort of chemical reaction and physical reaction is happening in the supernovas and in the galaxies. And yet again, they exist in this very immaterial, mysterious form. But they go hand in glove. How? Why is the physical world working so well with something that is so clearly non-physical? Why is the material world working so well with something that is immaterial? And so naturalism is unable to explain satisfactorily why numbers apply to the physical world. To them, it's just a happy coincidence. It just happened, right? Numbers exist. They will go about how it exists, in what form it exists. And then this world that came about by pure chance, by pure random evolution. This world could not have been, some other universe could have been, which is what we covered last time, right? 10 to the power 500 as string theory predicts. That many worlds could have been, it just happened to be this world. And then again, in a naturalistic explanation, it's pure evolution. You don't have anyone else to guide. You only have evolution. Evolution is the only game. And so you have numbers that exist in this abstract form, and then a species evolves by pure chance, which happens to have the cognitive ability to make sense of these abstract immaterial numbers and then sees the connection between that and the physical world. What is the probability that all of these is going to happen by pure chance? For naturalism, you don't have any other explanation. You just have to say it's coincidence. And even when you read into the works of hardcore atheist philosophers who push back to the case that we say, their bottom line is this: coincidence. But they would go into philosophical depths to say it's brute coincidence, it's a brute fact, or something of that sort. But they come to the terms that it's just sheer coincidence. Now, for someone who is trying to make sense of why this is the way it is, Eugene Wigner's observation is very clear. This is a miracle. It's a wonderful gift. It's astonishing and amazing that this is the way it is. So then which worldview is able to make sense of this? For an atheist, for a naturalism, it's just pure chance. But for the theist, there is a very clear picture behind it. Why? The answer for the theist is very clear and coherent within his theistic worldview. The God who drew up the blueprint of the universe using the numeral systems that we see, created the universe on that same blueprint. And we will look at a quote later on, but that to the Christian is a simple answer. And it was suggested way back in the first century by Philo of Alexandria, where he used the example of an architect drawing a blueprint and then creating cities and towers and buildings of concrete and brick out of that blueprint. And so if someone asks, why is the blueprint and the actual city matching so well? Well, it's because there was an architect who drew up the blueprint and then built the city from the ground up. And what makes this case of mathematics very interesting is that we have not just simple arithmetics of 1, 2, and 3. We have stuff like root of -1. These very higher order complex mathematics that do not even actualize in the real world. Now, if you read into it, you'll find stuff like the Higgs formulations as it applies in quantum mechanics and all of those complex parts, which do not make sense in the physical world that we see. But then again, when they get into quantum mechanics and the quantum realm, these mathematics find themselves applicable and made realized. And so again, mathematics wonder, how does this make sense? How is it you have these very complex mathematics that is still finding itself actualized in the quantum realm? And so it adds to the sense of wonder in the way mathematics interacts with the real world. Now, even if someone says that maths, numbers, arithmetics, oh, it's just useful fiction that we created to make sense of the world, the question still remains, how is it that this useful fiction still works so well with the physical world? That's the question. Even if we humans created it, how is it that something that we created as a useful fiction works so well with the physical world? Again, the answer for the naturalist is pure coincidence. But for the theist, there is a more robust answer. And so the case that we would use from mathematics to God looks like this. If God does not exist, the applicability of mathematics is just a happy coincidence. The applicability of mathematics is not just a happy coincidence. Therefore, God exists. This led to one of the brilliant physicists of our time, Dirac, to say that one could perhaps describe the situation by saying that God is a mathematician of a very high order, and he used very advanced mathematics in constructing the universe. Now, the depth of this argument goes when one reads into, again, complex order mathematics and see how the arguments flow with each other. But the bottom line that we can use this is, and here's why I feel this argument is going to be quite helpful for us. It's going to pique anyone's interest when you talk about the existence of numbers. It's going to pique anyone's interest when you talk about how numbers exist and why they interact with the world. And it can be a very good food for thought, a stone in someone's shoe for them to go home and ask themselves, why does numbers work so well with the real world? In what form do numbers exist? And an exploration that would take them to Google would, I believe, would somewhere down the line point them towards an article or a video on how mathematics makes the case for God. So that is the first argument that we covered, mathematics and God. And now we move on to the second one, right? Like I said, one of the most persuasive and most serious argument that we can make for the existence of God. Now, I don't know how many of you know this person. You may have seen the picture in the news, you may have read about this person, but this is Dominique Pellicotte. Maybe that name rings a bell. Dominique Pellicotte this year was convicted for drugging, raping his wife, and inviting over 50 other men to do the same to his unconscious wife. And just a couple of days back, I saw the news that just a couple of days back, his daughter accused him of doing the same to her. And the police, as part of the investigation, as they rummaged through the footages and video clips in his devices, found videos and images of his daughter and daughter-in-laws in compromising situations where videos were taken without their knowledge. Now, when just this past few days back, Dominique Pellicotte in the court pleaded guilty to all charges. And he said that all the other men who cooperated with him, went along with him, are also equally guilty. But the other men, around 50 of them, said that they're not guilty, said that they don't consider what they did as rape. They said that what they did appeared to be consensual, that they don't think, they don't at ever point thought that the wife was not consenting to it. So the question right now is, what do you do with someone like Dominic Pellicott? What do you do with something of this sort of a news? Now, we have an immediate reaction to what should be the case, what should be the judgment. But if Dominic Pellicott were to stand before the judge, the jury, and his wife, and he says, "No, I don't think what I did was wrong," what should the court say? Now, believe me, we may think that this question is very easily answerable. We may think that no human with a sane mind would object to what we think is the right answer. But the moment you present this argument for the existence of God, you will find your atheist friends who know what the weight of this argument is immediately say the unthinkable. Now, before we move into that, let's get some of the terminologies right. A phrase that we would use in making sense of this argument, or in as we used to make this sensible to others, would be objective and subjective. What do we mean by that? Well, consider the case of ice creams, right? I like vanilla ice cream. There are those who would prefer butterscotch or chocolate over vanilla ice cream. Now, the preference for ice cream among people is subjective. It's based on the subject, which is why we don't make too much of a scene. I, the subject, like vanilla. You, the subject, may like chocolate. But the amount of calorie in a scoop of vanilla ice cream is objective. It doesn't matter whether I like vanilla, it doesn't matter whether I hate vanilla. The amount of calorie, the amount of sugar in a scoop of ice cream is exactly that. It doesn't change based on the likings or preference of me, the subject. So that is objective, based on the object, but the taste and preference is subjective, based on the subject. And which is why we don't make too much of a fuss if someone prefers one flavor over the other, but we make too much of a fuss if a company puts a false marking over a product that they make, saying this has zero palm oil in it, or this has zero added elements in it. Why? Because one is subjective, it's fine. Another is an objective claim, it has consequences. So that's subjective and objective. Now, another terminology to be clear, this is not terminology that we're going to use in making sense, but it's good for you to know. Relative versus absolute. Sometimes people would talk about relative morality, but in the discussion on morality, relative and absolute are not the same as objective and subjective. Absolute morality would talk about something that is absolutely right or wrong, no matter what the circumstance. Right? So taking a human life, if someone says taking human life is absolutely wrong, then in self-defense also it's absolutely wrong. When a soldier takes on a terrorist also it's absolutely wrong. And in a case of a cold-blooded murder also, it's absolutely wrong. But if it's relatively wrong, then based on the circumstance, it's wrong. So someone driving a car comes and hits them, and they swerve and hit someone else, it's not murder. Why? Because given the circumstances, it's not murder that they've committed. Right? So that's the difference between relative and absolute. I just put it out there because sometimes we use the term, when we talk to someone, we say, relative morality is in the case, or we may use the relative to be substituted for subjective. That's not exactly the case. So it's good to have our terminologies clear. So objective and subjective refers to the subject and the object being involved. Relative and absolute refers to the circumstances being involved. If something is absolutely wrong, then in every circumstance, no matter what, it's always wrong. If it's relatively wrong, then based on the circumstance, the preference is not relevant there. The preference or the likings of the person is not relevant there. It's just the circumstance that is the key determining factor. Then values and duties. Now this distinction is extremely clear, extremely important in making the force of this argument clear. Values refer to the inherent worth of an action, right? Good and bad. So it's a good thing for a person who has done commerce to go and do economics or MCom or BCom or MBA or anything of that sort. It's a good thing. We can say it's a bad idea. It's not an inherently great idea to go and take up a science field after doing commerce. But you won't be doing a wrong thing if you do that, right? You are not morally prevented from doing it. So values, and I use that example to bring out that values, the term values talk about an inherent worth of an action. Is it a good action or is it a bad action? But duties, as the word implies, refers to an obligation. Should I do it? Should I not do it? Must I do it? Must I not do it? So that is where we would use the terms right and wrong. Values talk about good and bad, duties talk about right and wrong. Now, the argument that we are making makes sense of both. So, here's the first part of the argument. If God does not exist, then objective, moral values, and duties do not exist. This is the first part of the argument. Okay. So, what does it mean to say that objective moral values and duties do exist or do not exist? William Craig gives this very crisp and clear implication of what it means. He says that to say that the Holocaust was objectively wrong means it was wrong even though the Nazis thought it was right, and it would still have been wrong even if the Nazis had succeeded in exterminating or brainwashing everybody who disagreed with them, so that it was universally believed the Holocaust was right. So if something is objectively wrong, it doesn't matter how many people think it is right. It doesn't matter if everyone thinks it is right, it is still objectively wrong. That is what it means objectively wrong. It's not dependent on whether the majority thinks or not. It means it is absolutely independent of what humans as subjects think. Now, what does moral values look like under atheism? Well, if atheism is true, first of all, we are here by chance, right? And if atheism is true, then evolution is the only game that we have to deal with. So we are here by pure chance, and we are wired to purely survive. We are survival driven. So we are to strive and pursue anything and everything that aids our survival. So we are adapting, we are getting better, we're getting stronger. Why? Because we want to survive, and evolution drives us to do that which enables us to survive. So under atheism, good stuff, moral values, so good stuff are the ones that enable us to survive, are the ones that push us to survive. So there's two implications for that. One, is that the way we are to make sense of society? Do we look at anything that enables a person to survive the next day, the next year, and does that become immediately good? So is it good for a person to steal if it means he can survive? Is it good for nations to conquer other nations and pillage if it means that that whole society and nation can survive? So that's the first part. Is survival purely the determinant of what is good and what is bad? The other thing is, it leaves the question open whether survival itself is a good thing, whether survival itself is to be pursued. But one thing is clear is that under atheism, you can't have objective moral values. Now, that's not us saying that, that's Richard Dawkins saying. He says that there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pointless indifference. We are machines for propagating DNA. It is every living object's sole reason for being. So this is what moral values looks under atheism. First of all, there is no real moral values. There is no good, no evil. But we are there just to propagate our DNA. Now, to tell humans that you are there to propagate your DNA has significantly gruesome implications for society. To say that that's all that we are to do. That's all that we are wired for. We're just machines to propagate DNA no matter what. And atheist philosopher Michael Ruse, well renowned, he says that under this construct, ethics is illusory. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory. So any sort of moral standing or duty or value that we demand upon humans to show among each other is not really there. It's just an illusion. We just use morality to survive and reproduce, and that's about it. So this is what moral values look like under atheism. Now, what about moral duties under atheism? This is extremely difficult to defend under atheism. Even if they get through by some means to have moral values under atheism, it's extremely difficult to have moral duties under atheism, and we'll see in a while now. Because duties imply obligations, right? You have an obligation to do something, to act in accordance with something. That's about what duties mean. Which is why we can say that a human can murder, but an animal always kills. Right? The moral implications is distinct for a human and a non-human. And the primary reason is again because of our existence as persons, which is why moral duties imply upon us. That is the whole way of saying the word murder, right? It is talking about an implied moral sense there, right and wrong being there. But for animal, it's just killing. There is That's all there is to it. Nothing more, nothing less. Now, here's the thing. If there is no one beyond human existence, if we humans are all that there is, then who imposes and demands accountability? Who is there to demand duties from us? Who is there to say that this is how it should be and this is how it ought not to be? That's never the case, right? Imagine you're walking down the street and or you're about to take your car or you're about to step out of your house and you see a paper kept on the windscreen or on your door that says that a curfew is in place, that you should not step out. Now, if that piece of paper has just that text on it and nothing else, you won't feel any sort of impulse or response to obey it. But if it has the seal of the Indian government, the Ashoka capital, or the seal of the Bangalore Metropolitan City Police, or the UAE national emblem, or anything of that sort, any sort of authoritarian figure on it, any sort of authoritarian symbol on it, then suddenly that directive has weight. On the other hand, if it's just a piece of paper saying there is a curfew in town, don't get out, you don't see any need to obey it. Why? Because who is there to demand it? It's just a statement. Who is there to say that I must not step out or I shouldn't step out? And then what happens is that you may look at actions of rape and incest and say that it is undesirable, it is bad, it is not good, it is bad, but it just becomes a matter of preference. It's just taboo, it's bad, we don't like it, but there is no one to say that you should not do it. There is no one to say that you must act rightly or anything. And so, like I said, with atheism, people somehow try to say that we can have moral values. So they would come up with what we call as atheistic moral Platonism. So they take the thought of Plato to say that, well, love, humility, patience, all these good virtues exist in some form. So they sort of exist like numbers in this immaterial form that we are able to interact with. And these values exist. So yes, you can have moral values under atheism because they just exist out there. It needs to be seen what it means for love to just exist. But even if we grant that, the question is, let's say you have love, humility, patience, and all the good values existing, floating around. You also have these bad values floating around. Hate, pride, impatience, and so on and so forth. Now, who is to say that I must live my life in accordance with the good values? If they're just equally floating around, why can't I live my life being hateful, proud, and impatient? Why can't I pursue bad values? Why can't I choose and always reject good values? Who is there to say that I'm doing it wrong? Who gave you the authority to say that I'm doing wrong? After all, it's just as humans. And if I can make the case that what I did is there to propagate my DNA, is there to aid my survival and reproduction, then within an evolutionary perspective, I can do anything that aids my survival. Imagine the society that we would be building if those were the fundamental constructs that drive our existence. If that is what were the pillars of society. Obviously, that is not the way we live. So then why is atheism feeling so out of touch with the way we live? And that leads Richard Taylor, famous atheist, essays to say that the concept of moral obligation, duties, is unintelligible. It doesn't make any sense. Apart from the idea of God, the words remain, but their meaning is gone. He understands the implication. Even if you say love your neighbor as yourself is a good thing, even if you say you must treat all humans with equal respect, even if you say that all humans require dignity, even if you say that racism is evil, that rape is evil, even if you say all of this, there is no moral obligation for any person to do so. It's just your opinion. It's just an evolution's outworking. It's just the way it is. But there is no obligation to say that we ought to do it that way. Now, if we try to build a society along that lines and we say, okay, you know what, let's agree on what everyone agrees together. Let's agree on the majoritarian opinion. You immediately see where that can go haywire. You just have to look at Nazi Germany. That's a system where the majority's opinion on what is good and bad, right and wrong, were inflicted upon the others. So you can't go with that. Which is why we understand how revolutions and activism and undoing the evil of the past always have come about. It's when the minority realizes it's evil and stands up against the majority. It's when one person realizes it's evil and stands up against the 99. So you can't have morality built on majority. It must be based somewhere else where even a single human should be able to discern and make sense of it. And so the argument that we make from this towards God looks like this. Before that, the other question, right, in this case that comes up is, are we saying that atheists cannot be moral? Are we saying that atheists cannot be good people? The argument is not that. The argument is that if God does not exist, then you cannot have objective moral values. It's not whether you believe in God or not. If God does not exist, if there is no standard for morality, your relation to that standard is irrelevant. If there is no standard, if there is no higher authority, you don't have objective moral values and duties. And even the Bible makes clear that the Gentiles who do not have the law do by things required by the law. Because why? Because the law is written on their hearts, their consciousness, and their thoughts, sometimes accusing them and sometimes even defending them. So even biblically, theologically, it's very clear that we are not saying that an atheist person cannot do good things. We're not saying that an atheist person cannot do right things. That is never the argument. The argument is, if you do not have God, you do not have morality. So the structure is premise 1. If God doesn't exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise 2. Objective moral values and duties do exist. Now, like I said, this may look as very easy to defend because this is how we make sense of the world. Whether the culprits behind the Nirbhaya case or whether Dominic Pellicotte and all his other friends said that they did not consider it to be wrong, we would say that no, what you did is objectively wrong and therefore you are to be punished. That's the way we all operate. That's the way all of your atheist friends also would look at societal matters and give a comment. If you were to say that homosexual people are not Christians, or if you were to say anything of that remote sense, they would look at you and call you a bigot. They would look at you and call you, all sorts of stuff. And they would look at the Bible and the contents of the Bible and the verses and all that stuff and pick anything as they want to pick and would say that it is evil, it's bad. How can you worship such a God? And make all of these moral claims, assuming that there is a moral standard that is impending upon all of us. Assuming that there is a moral standard that weighs itself upon a text that is thousands of years old, written across cultures. But when you bring this argument before them, I have seen countless times, even within our Confident Christian Conversations group that we run in SAFT, even there, otherwise smart, sensible atheist fellows, when it comes to this, and even when the women in our group have pushed them on it, have skittled away from saying, and even at some certain points outwardly saying that they do not consider rape to be objectively wrong. Now, why are they doing that? Because they know what the implication is. If they concede that something is objectively wrong, then they must make sense of where that source of objective wrongness is coming from, where that objective moral code is coming from. Which is why I said that this argument has that significant implication. It makes them come to terms with what they truly believe within themselves. Because when you look at all the other arguments, it has its way, it is effective, it is capable in clearing the mist and helping them see clearly the rationale for belief in God. But all of that they can still wiggle out. And if you talk about the Kalam, they could say, quantum mechanics, this and that, and still try and get away, right? Because then you have to read into quantum mechanics to give the answer. Or with the fine tuning, they can again try and wiggle away and say that, you know what, I think it's luck, and still say in front of you that they have a very consistent position. They can do all of these stuff to wiggle away from the implications or to give the impression that they are consistent all throughout. But when it comes to the moral argument, that is a place that they can't just do that. Because either they have to say that objective moral values and duties absolutely do not exist, which means that they have taken away every sort of right and privilege that they had to comment on any moral matter, which has immediate implications for when they say, if God exists, why evil? Because if you say that objective evil doesn't exist, if you say that right and wrong doesn't exist, if you say that good and bad doesn't exist, if it's just purely subjective preference, then on what standard are you judging my belief? On what standard are you judging the Bible? On what standard are you judging the God I believe in? And under what standard are we all subject to the moral claims that you are making? Isn't what you are saying similar to I like ice cream, you like chocolate? I like vanilla, you like chocolate? Isn't it just merely preferences that we have? So for them to use a moral standard to judge and have implications on the Bible and the claims of the Bible, to have a moral high ground, they must concede that objective moral values and duties do exist. If so, if they concede part 2, then the first part comes up. Okay, where do they exist? How do they exist? Again, remember, that's where the moral duties part is very clear. Even if they say like Plato's thought of, love, justice, these exist in some form, it's there and we just do it. The question is, why should I live in accordance to these good values? Why can't I live in accordance with these bad values? Where is the sense of responsibility and obligation that's coming from? Evolution? No, evolution doesn't make through. If you just follow the train of thought, it just becomes disastrous on its own. Evolutionary thought is what drove eugenics. So are you fine with that? Are you fine with killing off the weak, and the inefficient and the vulnerable in society? If they're abortionists, if they're pro-abortion, they would say yes to the last part. But then you can ask them, okay, so you're fine with Hitler's view, the weak and the ailing and those that with diseases, pull back society. We need to have a survivalistic, fit society that can survive for eons to come. Do you think Hitler was right? Probably they'll say no. So Hitler was absolutely wrong. Can you say that Hitler is absolutely wrong? Because I thought, based on your standard, objective morality doesn't exist. So that is the key clincher in this. And for us, how do we make sense that moral values are objectively there? Well, it's the same way that we make sense of the physical world around us, right? When I touch this table, when I interact with the physical elements around me, my default position is that this is all objectively true. My default position is that I am not hallucinating, that I am not standing in the middle of my office and speaking and giving this talk. No, I am actually in my home, in my desk, standing and giving the talk. My default position is that when I go into the shower and I take a shower, I am actually in the privacy of my shower and taking a shower. I am not doing all of that in church. So my default position is that I am not hallucinating all of this, that my interaction with the objective world is real, that my sensory perception is true and valid. And that's the same default position that we have. Our moral perception, when we look at all of these actions of evil, bad, and wrong, our moral perception that these are objectively bad, objectively good, objectively right, objectively wrong, are equally valid as saying this table is objectively here, you are objectively looking at the laptop, you are objectively hearing my voice. And unless we have any reason to reject those default positions, we can continue to hold them. Because if you reject those default moral perception, you have to reject your default physical perception as well. So just give it a train of thought and see what implications it would be if you start doubting your physical perceptions. You can never trust. I'm going to take a next step. Am I dreaming? Am I actually going to walk off a cliff? Am I hallucinating? Or am I actually in my house and taking a step onto a solid concrete or tile floor? If you start doubting, you start doubting your whole existence. And so if God doesn't exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. And then we come to see that objective moral values and duties do exist, which leads us to the conclusion that therefore God exists. And so that is the last part of this case-making argument that we have made. Now we're going to look into the apologetics lab bit. And since we are a bit in number, like I said, we won't go into breakout room. Now this is the point I would invite you all to come on camera if possible. And we will look at a couple of scenarios where we'll just brainstorm. And I think for the sake of time, I don't want to hold anyone back for too long. What I'll do is I'll just take one scenario and we can brainstorm and see how we can find answers to it. So in the meantime, while I pull up the scenarios, I would invite those of you who are able to come on video. All right, so here's the first scenario, and let me just drop it in the chat. This is one that I have also seen come up in my personal conversation as well. The question is, if morality is based on God's nature, then it is subjective because it is based on the subject God. How can you say it is objective? So, take a shot at it. What would be your immediate responses to this? Yeah. Any thoughts? Any quick remarks on how you would tackle this? Okay, so I'll go ahead and give the answer, and then maybe you can take a look at the next one. So when we are talking about the existence of morality in objective or subjective, the point of reference is the humans. That's where the whole discussion is. That's where the whole dialogue is from the get-go. Is it based on us humans or is it based somewhere else? That is why we're talking about objective versus subjective. That's the whole reference point. Now, once we clear that and we clarify that to them, if they say, okay, fine, it's based on God, it is still subjective. Even now, let's change the reference point from us to God. As far as we humans are concerned, morality is objective for us. Why? Because it's not based on us as a subject. It's irrelevant, independent of our personal likings. So morality has become objective for us. Now we're talking about if it's based on God, is a subjective or objective. That is a different line of discussion. For the sake of for the concerning of the argument, we have proved the argument. P2 is proved. Objective moral values and duties do exist. When it comes to the second part that they want to ask, therefore, is it based on God, is it subjective? That is where we would answer from the Christian theological perspective. And we would say that he is the same yesterday, today, and forevermore. Morality is based off of God's nature. It is not arbitrary. It is not something that he comes and says today and changes tomorrow, or it is not some code that is existing beside God that God looks into and then says. Morality is based in God's nature. He is changeless, immaterial, and timeless, and therefore that moral code doesn't change. Unlike with us humans who undergo change and we change our preference, likings, and we're subject to so many things. So that clarification in the change of point of reference is very crucial to make this distinction. Yeah, is that clear? Oh, okay. Right, and I will use just one more. I think I have this copied for me. Okay, here's a straightforward one, because again you will run into this very clearly, and this is something that maybe I want you to open up and say how you would respond in this circumstance. So they would say, for me personally, rape is wrong. Right? Maybe even the victim would say it is wrong, but the culprit might say it is not wrong for him. This is genuinely exact remarks I have heard from atheist folks, and not just your random atheist folks, but people who are involved with atheism in Kerala. We were in a group with some of the folks from Essence, and there were these 50, 55-year-old grown-up men who have led families, who were looking to redeem society from the clutches of the evils of religion, saying exactly this. So if someone were to say this to you, what would be the line of response you would take? Yeah, I would invite anyone to, yeah, Pastor.
Yeah, so probably I think for an atheist, this statement can be true, because for atheists, he doesn't have any, whatever the moral system that whether it's objective or subjective, moral values that we speak may not exist. So you would say it's okay, all subjective things are kind of depends on situation to situations. But the The bigger problem is then probably we cannot have any laws or rules or any kind of system in the world where how can we stop the crime? So anyone can. So as you mentioned before, even what Hitler has done is right. So
Hmm.
how can I say if someone coming and invading my own privacy? I have no rules and I cannot go and say that okay, this law must. I can't even make a law by saying that
Yeah.
okay, doing such and such is wrong because it's my personal thing. Whatever I like, I can do it. So I think that
Hmm.
kind of system will never exist. The world cannot even function a day in that manner. Yeah. If people just do, I mean, lawless society is not possible. Eventually, we will just kill ourselves or we do what we wants to do. We dance with the
Yeah.
DNA or whatever that we say.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. We will just descend into anarchy.
Yeah.
We will see what we see in the book of Judges, and in that day there were no kings, and each did as it was seen fit to him. That exactly what we'll
Right.
descend into.
Probably it's unlivable society for sure, and probably
Yes.
not even atheists would love to live in that society.
Yeah. Anyone else who want to chip in, add on to what Pastor said, or if yeah, Gracie,
Yeah,
go ahead. Yeah.
I wanted to say something similar. So if someone said this, I would actually ask him the question. I think it's okay to kill you. So that's fine. I mean, so that puts it very black and white, um,
Hmm.
very, very real, and very obviously not right.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. And and sometimes you would see yourself in conversations with folks who are just unbelievably stubborn to do away with God. That even if you say the even if you say even if you s- even if you refer to their action, it won't be convincing to them, to the point that the only way it appears that they would be shaken within their conscience to reconsider their position would be to use even other evil and say, what happens if I were to do that to you, right? What happens if I were to do that to your family member? Like that seems it seems that only those would shake them out of their conscience to say that, oh, maybe the person I'm saying is not something even I truly believe in. Because I still can't believe it that in that conversation in our group, that these smart atheist fellows who are clearly smart, very amicable in the conversation, not wackos running around and making scene, but genuinely engaged in the conversation, were so deliberately stubborn to concede that rape is objectively wrong. I was shocked. I did not expect that to happen, which shows that either they have turned off that moral senses within themselves and we are looking at actual psychopaths running around amongst us, or they have just come to terms with the fact that they're going to be absolutely inconsistent with themselves to just deny God whatsoever. And which is where in public conversation, if this comes up, it pushes them to come to terms with their innocence. And the moment they turn off the objective morality part is when they can no longer point out, if God, why evil? Because that's, and again, this I've seen this happen numerous times in conversation. They'll start with all of these questions on, oh, that command in the Old Testament, this in the Old Testament, people are dying there, people are dying, all of this, and immediately ask, okay, what is your standard for morality? And they have absolutely no answer whatsoever. They just skip around and
Yeah.
just keep going back to it over and over again, which is why yeah, yeah.
I have a question. I like see when it comes to our biblical worldview, specifically in the Old Testament, that's where most of the question is raised about how God has asked us Israelites to go out and kill people, or whatever the ways that God has asked them to wipe out the Amalekites. Or I mean, more of the questions
Yeah.
that's generally when it comes to evil and evil and good. That's where most of the atheistic question points. So are we? How do we answer from an objective moral reference point uh, to those questions, which is specifically on those things? Because I mean, whether people are really fully studying the Bible or not, the moment that you wanted to speak about evil and good, they're gonna point out to all these incidents that in the Old Testament. New Testament they may not have. They don't have many verses, but of course, Old Testament they have many verses to point out. So when if we clearly hold on to objective moral law, that's what our point is. That's our reference point is when we speak about probably what's the best way to answer. Where should we begin? I understand the answer what you're given, but saying that's okay. Of course, for you there is no answer. I understand. In the atheistic worldview, there is no answer. But if someone is a true seeker, he's was an atheist, but he was slowly coming into faith, or he really want to understand the Old Testament. Because recently I met a girl who coming to faith, but her reference point began is was not Jesus is God, and her reference point was more of the freedom that she has in a Christianity, and the freedom that she doesn't have the particular religious worldview. So that's a point where she started the exploring Christian faith. So my point is, what my question would be, what is that something that we can give to those questions, those who are earnestly or really seeking for an answer?
Yeah. Couple of things I would do is one thing to always keep in mind is a lot of the time these objections that come up refer to passages that I just described. Like, as you would obviously know, right? There are a lot of these passages that describe things that have happened. The books of Judges have a lot of stuff that are just described without God ever commanding or approving it. So that's always a key thing to keep in mind, to differentiate between what. Now, with the commands that the Lord gives for the conquest of Canaan, when I was doing my bachelor's, I did a 3 months reading into the whole conquest of Canaan passage, and I'm very much convinced that we are not looking at actual literal commands to wipe out. We are looking at hyperbolic languages that are used within the context of conquest against military-aged men fighting military-aged men. It is not talking about literal genocidal events happening there. But then that took a lot of reading. And if you read the books of Joshua and Judges side by side, you will see that very clear. You will see the change in the tone. You will see the hyperbolic language used repeatedly. Again, so another point, maybe the passage requires more attention. Maybe it's not a clear-cut case of an outright evil God commanding. But let's say we find a passage that looks like God is saying to go and attack an army or do something of that sort. How do we make it sense with objective morality? So this is where the difference between objective, subjective, and relative absolute comes into. Right? So God can give command X in circumstance Y, and that command X would be the right thing for the people to do, no matter what circumstance they are in, because it's an objective command for them. But God has given that command in that particular circumstance, which is very clear in the Old Testament. The command to go out and conquer the land was limited within the geographic conquest. They couldn't go and attack Egypt or Syria or Ur or anywhere and say, oh, the Lord has commanded. No. The Lord's command is specifically limited within the context of you claiming the land the Lord promised you. The Lord's command to do and conquest is specifically limited within the context of you passing judgment on the people in the land of Canaan. It's not for you to go and kill anyone and anyone who you see everywhere. So for the Israelites, it's an objective command. That's the right thing for them to do, to unleash God's judgment on the people who are sacrificing babies, engaging in bestiality and all of the evils in the land of Canaan. And God gave those commands within that circumstances. It is not meant to apply throughout all ages for the Israelites to do all over the world. It wasn't a call for global conquest. So the objective morality part still holds there without being applicable into an absolute way. And in this sense, we refer to what is known as the divine command theory, wherein God's divine commands reveal his nature, and they are always in line with his nature. So any command that the Lord gives, any proposition that the Lord presents about himself are always in line with his nature, and any judgment or calls of action that the Lord gives, those commands are also in line with his nature. So the objective part would still remain valid there. Does that make sense? Did I answer your question?
Yeah, right. So we also could see actually the evil and God punishing the evil, very much true for his own people also, because when you read the prophetical books, you see Israel also being punished or disciplined because of their own sin. So it is not that God is being generous to one group of people and being sympathetic to one group of people, but rather God used the same standard. Last week was also reading I think book of not Joel, another prophetical book where God started judging all the nations. At last, God judges Judah and Israel also for the same crime. So God is not partial in that. Even his own people were disciplined. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So that's right. So you say more of it. It is actually for that particular nation because that nation supposed to be Israelites, and it's not a massacre that you see around the globe where Israel is never asked to go out in the world and do the same.
Yeah.
And at the same time, God was also judging the evil that was already existed at the present time,
In the land. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, which is okay. Yeah. Okay, thanks.
And like, so that's the exact same pattern that we see the Lord doing in the book of Hosea. We see the Israelites asking, okay, we screwed up, and you have let the Babylonians come and deal with us so evilly. Now,
Yeah,
what about them, right? So God is using the Israelites to bring judgment on the Canaanites, and then He's using Babylon to bring judgment on the Israelites. So that is completely consistent from the Lord.
right,
Yeah, Joel.
right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if I missed something that you said, but you were saying about even pagan people or people who don't believe in the Bible still having some form of, or they abide by the law. I'm not sure if I missed something, but that got me thinking. Like there are societies that have not connected with the larger world, but they still practice evil. For example, the let's say Amazonian tribe, or let's say we have a tribe in Andamans that has not connected to the world, and let's say they continue to practice child sacrifice, which we know morally is evil. So then, how is moral values objective? Because in their eyes, it isn't, and from their understanding, it's naturally not substantive.
Okay, what do you mean by in their eyes it's normal and it's not naturally substantive? Like, what do you mean by that?
I mean, they again, going back to that verse, or the part that you told, that even the pagans abide the law. They have that understanding that this what you're doing is wrong. To these tribes or these groups that continue to practice it and have not seen the larger world, they don't have that understanding or that consciousness that what I'm doing is wrong. So then, the moral values or morality doesn't stand there, right?
No, it does. That's what we mean by objective morality. So to give a parallel thing, right? A person who's colorblind literally can't make sense. Okay, let's say I don't know the medical terminologies of how to phrase it, but there are varying grades, right? So there are those who just see black and white sorts of stuff. There are others who see mixed color variants and all of that. A person who sees the world as purely black and white because of the color blindness, um, genuinely sees the world as black and white. Now, does that make a blue flower a black flower? No. The flower is still blue. It's on account of that one person's defect that they are perceiving that world through their senses in a defective way. So the flower still remains blue. It doesn't mean that we therefore stop saying that the flower is blue, or that we stop referring to the flower as blue, or we do away with our obviously clear physical experience or sensory experience of the world, which includes that flower being blue. And I would say that that is practically basically what would apply there in that circumstance as well. Now, when I showed that quote about William Lane Craig saying, right, if even if the Nazis were able to convince and brainwash everyone and kill everyone who thought otherwise, and every single person on planet Earth thought that the Holocaust was a good thing, the phrase objective morality would imply and mean that Holocaust is still wrong. Now, how do we look at the Holocaust, or how do we look at an evil committed in the news and say it's evil? Is because of the moral perception that we have of the world, an intuitive moral perception, just like we have an intuitive physical perception, a sensory perception of the world, and they both go hand in hand. And we have that intuitively, and we also, as a case in point, see that that is what everyone is having intuitively, just like we all share a sensory perception of the world equally about the objective world, and that substantiate what we already know, that these things are objectively truly wrong, and we know that intuitively. So any way deviation from that is seen just as a touch out of reality, a touch out of society, and a touch out of basically what I said, touch out of reality as well. So when we look at a person who's a psychopath, who's a clinically diagnosed psychopath or a clinically diagnosed sociopath, and they are just unmoved by the murder that they do or the evil that they commit, it doesn't mean that therefore that what they did stops being wrong. If we can apply and hold that same standard there, then I think it also applies and holds in the case for someone who is in the tribal scenario as well. That is, so it starts off with what we understand objective morality to mean and whether we think objective morality holds. If we say that morality is subjective, it's all up to each one of them, then like you said, that culture says X is bad, we say X is good, so we are all left to our own. But I think that is an implication dealt only for those who hold on to subjective morality. I don't know if I made sense or if I left you more confused. So
No, you made sense. Yeah. Thank you.
I will drop the other scenarios. Anyway, I will share the outline with you. And if anyone of you want to get the answers to the other scenarios, maybe you can drop in the group. The group also will become a bit more lively in that sense. But if there's no other question, if there's anyone, I can take one more. Okay, cool. That's about it. So I will go ahead and stop the recording.